Welcome to Empathy Stories, where every tale is a journey through the human heart. Today, we share the powerful story of Tommy, a homeless boy who discovers an unexpected connection with a wealthy stranger. His quest for answers, redemption, and the truth about his past will leave you reflecting on the power of family and forgiveness. Stay with us as we explore the twists of fate that change lives forever. On a bitter winter morning, Tommy's breath formed small clouds in the icy air as he rummaged through the trash behind Gino's pizzeria. His small, trembling hands dug through the debris with practiced ease, searching for anything that could ease the gnawing hunger in his stomach. At just 12 years old, Tommy had already learned the harsh realities of survival on the streets. Lessons no child should ever have to master. His coat, much too thin for the season, hung loosely around his shoulders, and the gloves he wore were little more than scraps of fabric, more whole than cloth. Yet, he pressed on, undeterred by the chill that seemed to settle deep into his bones. The dumpster offered little in terms of options, and Tommy's stomach growled louder with each passing minute. But then, his eyes caught something, a half-eaten pizza, its greasy box miraculously intact. It wasn't much, but to Tommy, it was a feast. He carefully lifted the box, cradling it in his arms as if it were treasure. As he made his way back to the abandoned building that had become his home, the faint taste of victory filled his senses. For now, he had won. He had found food. Tommy's home was an old, condemned building on the outskirts of the city. The 5-story structure, with its boarded-up windows and graffiti-covered walls, was a grim reminder of the urban decay that surrounded him. The hallways were littered with debris, and the floors, worn thin by years of neglect, creaked underfoot. Yet, it was a shelter, his shelter, one that offered him a semblance of safety, if only in the darkest corners of his mind. As he slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence surrounding the property, Tommy made his way inside, where the air was thick with the musty scent of abandonment. His room, a former office space, had 3 walls intact, and the ceiling, while leaking, wasn't as bad as some of the other rooms. It was a rough existence, but it was his. He sat down on the floor, surrounded by the remnants of his makeshift bed, a stack of flattened cardboard boxes covered with a tattered blanket. The pizza, still warm, was a small luxury in a life that had seen very few. As Tommy took his first bite, he closed his eyes, savoring the fleeting taste of warmth and comfort. For a moment, it was as if he had been transported to a different life, one where he wasn't hungry, one where his mother, Sarah, was still alive, and the world hadn't been so cruel. In the quiet of the room, Tommy's eyes wandered to the only personal possession he had managed to hold onto through the years, a cracked picture frame containing a faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. His mother, Sarah. The image was the last reminder of a happier time, before everything had fallen apart. Tommy's earliest memories of her were full of warmth, her comforting embrace, the scent of the cheap perfume she wore, the soft sound of her voice reading him bedtime stories. They had been happy, once, but life, as Tommy would come to understand, had a way of testing even the strongest souls. His mother had been just 17 when she had given birth to him, abandoned by his father before he was even born. Yet Sarah had fought for him, worked tirelessly to provide for them both. Tommy had always admired her strength. But when he was 6, Sarah fell ill. She tried to hide it at first, pushing through the pain and fatigue. But it soon became clear that her condition was far worse than she had let on. The diagnosis was devastating, aggressive cancer, already spread to multiple organs. For the next 2 years, Tommy watched helplessly as his mother, once so full of life, withered away. Despite the mounting medical bills and endless hospital visits, Sarah fought to stay alive, always with Tommy by her side. But in the end, the cancer was too strong, and she died when Tommy was just 8 years old. Her last words to him were a whispered promise: "I love you, and I'll always watch over you." After her death, Tommy was thrust into the foster care system, bouncing from one home to another, never staying long enough to make any lasting connections. Some homes were indifferent, while others were cruel, treating him as little more than a paycheck. Tommy endured months of abuse before he finally ran away, choosing the cold, lonely streets over the heartache of foster homes. The first night on the streets had been terrifying, but as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Tommy had learned how to survive. He found shelter wherever he could, scavenged for food, and, above all, kept the memory of his mother close to his heart. The photograph, tucked safely in his pocket, was all he had left of her. On the hardest days, when the cold seeped into his bones and hunger gnawed at his insides, he would take it out and speak to it. He would tell his mother about his day, imagine her advice, and hold on to the hope that one day things might be different. Little did Tommy know, this cold, gray world was about to change. His life was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would unravel secrets he had never known and change everything he thought he understood about himself and his past. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, but the biting cold remained. Tommy stirred from his fitful sleep, his body aching from the hard floor beneath him. The first few moments of the day always felt like the hardest. The soft light of the sun, though a welcome sight, was still too weak to offer any real warmth. His body ached from the cold, his hands stiff from hours of exposure. The familiar routines began to set in, the quick wash with some bottled water, a change into the cleanest clothes he had, which was hardly much, and a careful check of his few possessions. His mother's photo was always in the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his heart. He knew the city would be just as cold and unforgiving as it had been the day before. But it didn't matter. Tommy had learned that the only way to survive was to keep moving, to keep looking for that next meal, that next shelter, and to keep his memories close. Today, however, was different. As Tommy walked through the busy streets, his stomach groaning with hunger, his eyes kept darting to the ground in search of any discarded food. He knew the best places in the city where he might find a small scrap of something. The local bakery was always a good stop, as the owner, Mr. Gennaro, was one of the few people in the city who didn't treat him like a nuisance. Every morning, Mr. Gennaro would leave a paper bag with old bread and pastries behind the bakery for people like Tommy to take. It wasn't much, but it was something. As Tommy approached the alleyway behind the bakery, however, something stopped him in his tracks. A police car was parked out front, and through the window, Tommy could see Mr. Gennaro talking to two officers. His stomach churned with worry. Had something happened to the kind old baker? Had someone reported him for helping the homeless kids like Tommy? He couldn't bear the thought of losing the one person who had shown him kindness in a world that had given him so little. Reluctantly, he turned away, his heart heavy as he moved on to find food elsewhere. The morning rush around Tommy grew louder as more people flooded the streets. Men and women in smart business attire clutched steaming cups of coffee, hurrying on their way to the office. To them, Tommy was just another part of the background, invisible, a nuisance to some, an object of pity to a rare few. But Tommy had learned to navigate the city's busy streets without drawing attention, to slip through the crowd unnoticed. He found a spot near the subway entrance, where he often sat and asked for spare change or food. His stomach growled louder now, but he kept his head down, not wanting to draw too much attention. As the crowd bustled around him, Tommy's gaze was drawn to a sleek black town car that had just pulled up to the curb. A well-dressed man emerged, his expensive suit and shiny shoes reflecting the wealth and power he carried. The man was talking loudly on his cell phone, barking orders to someone on the other end. Tommy watched him with mild interest, as the man seemed so distant from his own reality. As the man made his way toward the building, the wind suddenly picked up, whipping down the street with a force that startled him. In that split second, the man's phone slipped from his hand, clattering to the sidewalk. And as he reached to steady his tie, his wallet slipped out of his coat pocket and fell to the ground. Tommy's survival instincts kicked in immediately. He could grab the wallet and run. It could be food for days, maybe even enough money for a warm place to sleep. But something stopped him. He thought of his mother's voice, a memory so ingrained in him that it almost felt like she was still there with him. Honesty. Tommy, it's all we truly have in this world. Before he could second-guess himself, Tommy darted forward and picked up the wallet, calling out to the man, "Sir, you dropped this." The man turned, surprise crossing his face as he looked at Tommy, his eyes scanning the scruffy, ragged boy before him. For a moment, it seemed as though the man couldn't comprehend what was happening. Slowly, the man reached out and took the wallet from Tommy's outstretched hand. "Thank you, son," the man said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and something Tommy couldn't quite place. He was about to turn and walk away when the man paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What's your name, son?" he asked. "Tommy, sir. Tommy Evans," the boy said, his heart racing in his chest. The man's eyes widened. "Tommy Evans," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. His expression shifted, a look of shock crossing his face. Tommy couldn't understand why his name had caused such a reaction. "Well, Tommy Evans," the man continued, his stern face softening into something resembling a smile. "You've done me a great service today. This wallet contains some very important documents. I'd like to reward you for your honesty." Tommy hesitated. He had no idea what to say. The man pulled out a crisp $100 bill and handed it to him, the bill feeling heavy in his palm. It was more money than Tommy had seen in months. His fingers trembled slightly as he accepted it, half expecting the man to snatch it back at the last second. But the man's smile remained, and Tommy whispered his thanks. "Thank you, sir," he managed to say before the man turned to walk away. As the man disappeared into the building, Tommy stood on the sidewalk, his mind spinning with confusion. What had just happened? How had a simple act of returning a wallet led to this? With the $100 in his hand, Tommy turned toward the nearest diner, his stomach growling louder than ever. He didn't know where this newfound luck would take him, but for the first time in a long while, the future didn't seem so bleak. Little did Tommy know, his life was about to take a dramatic turn. As Tommy walked toward the diner, the $100 bill clutched tightly in his hand. His thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. His stomach churned with hunger, but his mind was elsewhere, processing what had just happened. He had never been the type to trust strangers, especially the rich ones, but something about that man's eyes, the way his face softened when he saw Tommy's honesty, unsettled him. For the first time in a long while, Tommy had been treated with a kind of dignity, a recognition of his worth as a human being. The diner was warm, a sharp contrast to the cold streets outside. Tommy ordered the largest meal he could afford with the $100, a luxury he had never experienced. As he ate, he glanced at the photograph of his mother, still safely tucked in his jacket. The image of her smiling face seemed to mock him. She had been gone for so long, and the void she had left in his heart was something he had carried with him for years. He didn't know if he could ever truly heal from her loss, but he held on to the photo because it was all he had left of her. His mind drifted back to the man who had given him the money, Tommy Evans. He had said, as though the name meant something. Was it just coincidence that his name had caused such a reaction? Or was there more to the story? The question gnawed at him. Tommy had never known his father. His mother had always been his anchor, her love his guiding star through the darkest days. But now, with the $100 burning a hole in his pocket and the image of that mysterious man flashing in his mind, Tommy felt something stir inside him. What if there was more to his story than he had ever known? When he finished his meal, Tommy felt both satisfied and uneasy. He left the diner and stepped out into the busy streets once more, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. He had to find answers. His mother had always told him that the truth would eventually find its way to the surface. And now, it seemed that truth was calling him. The next few days passed in a haze of uncertainty. Tommy couldn't shake the memory of the man and the photo, and the more he thought about it, the more he felt that his path was somehow tied to this stranger. He didn't know what the connection was, but he felt it deep inside. There was something about that man, about the way he had looked at him, that made Tommy believe that fate had something in store for him. Finally, after days of wrestling with his thoughts, Tommy decided to act. He couldn't just sit back and wonder what could have been. His heart pounded in his chest as he made his way to the imposing office building where the man had entered. The gleaming glass facade reflected the morning sunlight, and Tommy hesitated for a moment. His ragged clothes, His worn shoes and his unkempt hair seemed to mock the sleekness of the building before him. But he didn't let that stop him. He had to know. With each step, the anxiety in his chest grew. He reached the revolving doors, feeling out of place among the well-dressed people walking past him. Inside, the lobby was vast and intimidating, with polished marble floors and towering columns. Tommy's nerves were on edge, but he pressed forward, walking to the reception desk where a stern-looking woman sat. "Can I help you?" she asked, eyeing him with suspicion. "I need to speak with Mr. Hawthorne." Tommy stammered. "The man who dropped the wallet. I have something of his." The receptionist looked him over, clearly unsure of what to make of the scruffy boy in front of her. After a brief pause, she nodded and picked up the phone. Tommy's heart was in his throat. Would she let him speak to the man? What if he turned Tommy away? But moments later, the receptionist hung up, her expression slightly softer. "Mr. Hawthorne will see you," she said, her tone now more neutral. "Take the elevator to the top floor. His assistant will meet you there." Tommy nodded, too stunned to say anything. He stepped into the elevator, his hands trembling as the doors closed. His mind raced. What would he say when he met the man again? What answers would he find? The elevator ascended quickly, and when the doors opened, Tommy was led down a long hallway toward a set of double doors. The young assistant gave him a sympathetic smile before knocking and opening the door. Inside the office, Tommy's eyes immediately found the man. Mr. Hawthorne, the man whose photo he had found, the man whose face had changed Tommy's life, the man who was, in a way, his father. Tommy stood frozen in the doorway, his heart racing as his eyes locked onto Mr. Hawthorne. The room was grand, filled with expensive furniture and a view that stretched far beyond the city skyline. But Tommy barely noticed any of it. All he could focus on was the man standing behind a massive desk, staring at him with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. The world outside the office seemed so distant, so far removed from the life Tommy had known on the streets. But here, in this moment, Tommy felt as though everything was about to change. Mr. Hawthorne was sitting back in his chair, his piercing blue eyes never leaving Tommy's face. He was calm, but his gaze betrayed a depth of emotion that made Tommy's stomach twist. Slowly, the man stood up, his chair creaking under the weight of his movement. For a moment, it was as though time had slowed down. "So, you found something else of mine?" Mr. Hawthorne's voice was steady, though there was an undercurrent of something else, something deeper, something that made Tommy's throat tighten. Tommy swallowed hard. He could hardly believe what he was about to do. The photo, the one of his mother, still clutched in his hand, felt heavier than ever. He stepped forward, his body trembling, and placed the photograph onto the desk in front of Mr. Hawthorne. The man's eyes flickered to the photo, and Tommy watched in silence, his heart pounding in his chest. "Do you recognize her?" Tommy's voice was barely a whisper, his words hanging in the air, as though he feared the answer. Mr. Hawthorne's face changed in an instant, his brows furrowed, and his lips parted as if he were struggling to speak. He picked up the photograph carefully, his fingers trembling as they traced the edges of the faded picture. I do," Mr. Hawthorne replied slowly, his voice cracking slightly. He paused, holding the photograph in his hands as if it were something fragile, something that could shatter at any moment. His eyes met Tommy's, filled with a mixture of pain and recognition. "That's Sarah, your mother." Tommy's breath hitched in his chest. His mind raced as his body went numb. His mother? This man knew his mother? How? Why? He could feel the ground shifting beneath him, as though his entire world was being turned upside down. The answers he had been seeking all his life seemed to be within his grasp. Yet the uncertainty of it all weighed him down. His voice, when it came, was shaky. Who is the man with her? And why do you have this photo?" Tommy demanded, his words sharp with a mix of anger and desperation. He needed to understand, needed to know what this all meant. Mr. Hawthorne closed his eyes briefly, as though gathering his thoughts, then exhaled deeply. He sat back down in his chair, placing the photograph gently on the desk before him. His fingers drummed on the wood, a sign of the internal battle raging within him. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more vulnerable. "The man in the photo, that's me. Tommy," he said, his voice barely audible. I love your mother. We were together once. A long time ago." Tommy's heart skipped a beat. The words echoed in his mind, slowly sinking in. "This man, my father? I don't understand," Tommy murmured, his mind swirling with confusion. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why wasn't I with you after she died?" Mr. Hawthorne's face contorted with regret. He took a deep breath, his voice heavy with sorrow as he spoke. "I wasn't strong enough back then. Tommy," he said softly, "I made mistakes. I let my family's expectations, their pressure, destroy everything. I let her go when I should have fought for her. I was a fool." Tommy's chest tightened as he listened to the words he had longed to hear, but they did little to ease the pain inside him. His mother had fought so hard for him, and now, years later, here was the man who had left them both, admitting his regret too late. "I didn't know about you," Mr. Hawthorne continued, his eyes darkening with guilt. "After Sarah died, I tried to find you. I hired investigators, but they couldn't find any trace of you. All I knew was that you had been placed in foster care. I've been looking for you ever since." Tommy stood motionless, unable to speak, his mind overwhelmed with the flood of emotions that had been unleashed. He had lived his entire life feeling abandoned, isolated, and unloved. But now, here was this man, his father, telling him that he had been searching for him all these years. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Tommy asked, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you come for me?" Mr. Hawthorne's face twisted in pain as he struggled to answer. "I was ashamed. Tommy, I didn't know if you would ever forgive me. But when I saw you on the street today, when you said your name, I knew it was you, and I couldn't let you slip away again." Tommy's anger, his confusion, and his grief swirled together, a whirlwind of raw emotion. But something inside him softened, a small flicker of hope igniting. Could he forgive this man who had abandoned him and his mother so many years ago? "I don't know if I can forgive you," Tommy whispered, his eyes moistening with unshed tears. "But I want to try to understand." Mr. Hawthorne nodded, his eyes filled with relief and gratitude. "That's all I ask for. Tommy, I can't change the past, but I want to be here for you now. I want to be part of your life." For the first time in his life, Tommy felt the weight of something he hadn't known he was missing, the possibility of family. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the way he had always imagined it, but it was real. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough. The days that followed Tommy's encounter with his father, Richard Hawthorne, were filled with a whirlwind of emotions. Tommy had moved into Richard's penthouse, a world so different from the streets he had known. The lavish apartment felt surreal. The soft leather furniture and pristine marble floors a far cry from the cold, damp places Tommy had called home. But even with the comforts surrounding him, Tommy found it difficult to adjust. His first night in the penthouse had been one of restless sleep. The bed, soft and inviting, was nothing like the cardboard boxes he had slept on in his makeshift home. Yet, it was too quiet, too comfortable. Tommy could not remember a time when he had felt so alien in such a beautiful space. He spent the entire night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with questions, emotions, and the weight of the past that was still too fresh. Richard, for his part, was doing his best to bridge the vast gap between them. He made sure Tommy had everything he needed: clothes, food, medical care, and a tutor to help him catch up on his education. It wasn't much, but it was the beginning of a new chapter. He wanted to give Tommy every opportunity in the world. But Tommy's pain, his years of survival on the streets, couldn't be erased overnight. Despite Richard's efforts, the tension was palpable. Tommy resented being in a place where everything felt foreign to him, a place where wealth and comfort only served as reminders of the years he had spent without. The conversations with Richard were few, and each one felt forced, as if the words they spoke were only filling the silence rather than bridging the emotional divide between them. One evening, about a month after Tommy's move, things came to a head. Richard had been talking about plans for Tommy's future, mentioning schools, internships, and other opportunities he had envisioned for him. The kind of life Richard had always hoped for his son. Tommy, overwhelmed and filled with years of pent-up frustration, snapped. "Stop it," Tommy shouted, slamming his fork onto the table, his voice breaking. "Just stop trying to plan my whole life. You don't even know me." Richard froze, his face betraying the shock and hurt that Tommy's outburst caused. "Tommy, I'm just trying to give you opportunities," Richard said softly, trying to understand. "Opportunities?" Tommy scoffed, bitterness dripping from his words. "Where were these opportunities when Mom was working herself to death to keep a roof over our heads? Where were they when I was sleeping in abandoned buildings and digging through dumpsters for food?" Richard's face drained of color. "I didn't know," he began, his voice breaking. "I know you didn't know," Tommy retorted, standing up from the table. "But don't act like you can just walk in here and be my dad after all this time. You don't get to pretend the last 12 years didn't happen." With that, Tommy stormed out of the dining room, leaving Richard sitting there, stunned and devastated. Tommy's heart pounded in his chest as he ran to his room, slamming the door behind him. The anger, the hurt, the years of abandonment and loss all came crashing down on him. He collapsed to the floor, his body trembling with sobs as he let the weight of it all out. Hours later, a soft knock on the door broke through Tommy's haze. His tears had long since dried, but the weight of his emotions still hung heavy. He heard Richard's voice from the other side, hesitant and filled with concern. "Tommy, can we talk?" For a moment, Tommy considered ignoring him, but something in Richard's voice, a vulnerability he hadn't heard before, made him hesitate. Slowly, he opened the door. Richard stood there, his face weary and disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed. "I think it's time I show you something," Richard said quietly, holding a battered shoe box in his hands. Tommy stepped aside, allowing Richard to enter. They sat on the edge of Tommy's bed, the box between them. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he opened the box, revealing a collection of letters, photographs, and mementos. "After I left your mother," Richard began, his voice thick with emotion, "I tried to convince myself I was doing the right thing, that we were too different, that it would never work. But the truth is, I was a coward. I let my father's expectations and my own fears drive me away from the best thing that ever happened to me." He pulled out a stack of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. "I wrote to her every week for a year, but I never sent them. I was too ashamed, too afraid of her rejection. And when I finally worked up the courage to find her again, it was too late." Tommy listened, his anger slowly giving way to something else, a mix of sadness, understanding, and the faintest trace of empathy for Richard's pain. Richard pulled out more items, concert tickets for shows they had planned to attend, a small velvet ring box that had never been opened, and photos of Sarah Tommy had never seen before. They spoke for hours, sharing stories of the past, of Sarah, of their mistakes, and of the love that had once existed between them. Tommy finally understood that Richard's absence in his life wasn't just about neglect. It was about fear, regret, and the weight of expectations that had held him captive. As the night wore on, they talked, really talked for the first time. The silence between them wasn't one of distance or resentment anymore, but a silence full of possibility. They still had a long way to go, but for the first time, Tommy felt that something could be rebuilt, not instantly, but with time. And that, for now, was enough. Thank you for joining us here on Empathy Stories. Tommy's journey is one of profound change, healing, and the power of understanding. We hope it resonated with you. And if it did, please share this story with someone who may need it. Don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt tales of transformation and connection. We appreciate you watching and look forward to sharing more stories soon.